that opening bit?
Yes, so this is chapter 1, quite a short chapter, and I won't set it up in any way. I'll just start reading because hopefully it speaks for itself. In my right hand is a transparent bag holding my clothes, basic toiletries, and loose items of makeup. I step towards the automatic doors, which, sensing the movement, open with a whoosh, curtains announcing the matinee performance. I move forwards one small step, a second, and I'm through them out on the street. I stand entirely still, close my eyes, breathe in, hold for 2 beats, and then open my eyes wide and allow the world outside in. Beep, beep, a yellow cab speeds past, horn blaring at a weaving cyclist who narrowly misses bouncing off its front bumper. A woman in a beige woolen skirt suit with a thin pink trim, short rigid curls and a face worn tight, bends down to scoop up her small white dog's neatly laid shit with a tinted plastic bag turned inside out and worn over her fingers and thumb. The bag might be scented, probably is, but I can't isolate and identify that smell over the other smells writhing on top of each other, vying for attention. The odours of an average New York City street on an average spring day. Garbage, coffee, noodles, piss, hot dogs, burnt sugar, beer, bagels, sweet, bitter, soft, strong and sharp. The smells that become tastes when they travel up into your nose and down your throat. The grey, uneven patchwork pavement shakes, sizzles and bakes beneath my feet. I look from left to right, down at the concrete and up at the sky, or what's visible of it between the towering buildings on this block. Wisps of white clouds scatter across an otherwise blemish-free blue sky. The sun blazes, burns bright. Tucked under my left arm are the flowers I was sent with love 5 days ago by one of the handful of people who know the truth about where I've been. I'd insisted on carrying them out with me, hand tight around the base of the basket, even though the flowers, the yellow and white daisies that had brought sunshine into the green ward, died yesterday. The heads are bowed and broken and brown, the soil flaky and cracked. I pull them closer. I flag a taxi with the hand holding the bag, my belongings held aloft and bared. I step down off the curb, open the door, climb in the back, and just like that, I slide back into my life. Avenue D and 3rd, I say to the driver. I'm going back to my apartment in the East Village. My corner was once the very worst corner, the darkest corner of Manhattan's drugs and crime controlled no-go area. It's now home to people like me who push rental prices up and up, encouraging a Starbucks to open just 2.5 blocks away. Arriving home, I check my mailbox, which is overflowing, walk up the 3 flights of stairs and open the grey front door to my apartment, expecting resistance on the other side. 13 days ago, it was a wreck, more specifically, the wreckage of a life in bits. The sink was stacked with dirty dishes, the worktops covered with takeout cartons and empty bottles. In the living room, a carpet of crunched up beer cans, wine bottles rolling on their sides, the prongs of plastic forks sticking in my foot every time I tiptoed to the bathroom, which was covered in damp towels, dirty clothes. In the bedroom, there were more discarded clothes, twisted stained sheets, fallen single shoes, and bobby pins scattered like tiny tracks across the bed and floor. I feel both a rush of gratitude and a wave of shame crash into my chest as I walk into a transformed apartment. I don't allow myself to think of my friend's reaction when she came in, the door proving unyielding at first, after I gave her my keys to pick up some clothes. The message she will have inevitably shared, flying from Manhattan to Brooklyn and back again. Did you all know about the mess, about how bad things were? Should we clean it? She can't return to that, surely. I picture her picking up the discarded pills one by one, the survivors that were last seen falling from my mouth, sticking underfoot and skidding into dark corners. The breadcrumb trail that didn't lead me out of the woods, but was proof that I'd been deep, deep in there, lost amongst the trees. I dropped my bag by the door, put my dead flowers down on the desk. A curled, crisp leaf lands by my feet. I look out of the window, hear sirens ringing out on the streets below. I become cold with fear, unable to move. Are they coming for me?
Wow. Thank you, Terri. I just want to say to our audience who will have heard now that many of the issues that you address in your memoir touch really, really deep things around addiction, sexual abuse, childhood abuse. This one, a suicide attempt that you've had. So if people are upset or moved by these issues which touch all of us, I think just know that we will be talking about them, and that the Samaritans is always the best place to start. Their number is 116-123. But thank you for reading that scene that you open there, and ending with that going into the trees, that little Hansel and Gretel image of, going into this dark wood. You evoke so brilliantly your adult self, this brilliant, accomplished, flying by the seat of her pants woman, kind of making it in New York. All of us have seen Sex and the City, those you kind of know the pace, with this little girl who can't keep up. And I was thinking, I wanted to ask you about this. How did you get there? That's the question in so many levels. How did you get there? And how did you construct yourself? How did you make yourself up into this person who inhabited this world and who kind of hits the crash?
I think initially it was probably survival, really. When I was a really little girl and things were really bad at home, school was very much an escape for me, and somewhere I could be both a different person. So I understood the rules of engagement with school. I understood what the teachers wanted from me. I understood how to please them. And I kind of developed, almost weirdly at a very young age, a persona outside of the house that was very different to kind of, I suppose, this victim that I was at home, who was incredibly vulnerable, incredibly nervous, scared most of the time. And this kind of built up, I think, as I, went to university, and then I got a job, built my career. I think it was the continuation of that, of developing this person to everybody else, who was quite tough in many ways, who was very ambitious, who I suppose sought validation through successes, what are seen as material successes or career successes. And the thing that I was always struggling with was, as you say, the kind of, you can't really escape the person inside who was victimized at 5 or 6, and that person is kind of pushed into a corner, and you go, I'm not her anymore. I can remember saying to a partner at the time, oh, that happened to me, but it's got nothing to do with me. That person isn't who I am anymore. And I think that complete disconnection and disassociation was really necessary. And I think it's very common in women who have endured childhood sexual abuse. But in and of itself, that obviously stores up a lot of later problems, because the disassociation is really hard to maintain. It's not particularly always healthy. And I think the more ill I got, and weirdly the more successful at work I got at the same time, the two parts of me stretched further apart until it essentially snapped.
So it's like a kind of a split, sort of split self. I remember there's a wonderful thing that the poet, gone blank now, but her phrase was, abyss knows no biographer, Emily Dickinson. She wrote it in a letter, that in the abyss, which I imagine is this kind of split in the self. And you described so brilliantly what happens when you fall into this abyss, which is a divide in the self. And one of the things, what I wanted to, which made me think back to you, this highly successful woman, and the child that you were. You talk at this point, and then later when you're describing being in the unit, your elaborate way of doing your hair. I imagine the sort of like Amy Winehouse kind of like hairpiece, and it's like you made yourself up as a woman each day. You made yourself up, and then there's a scene which you write about your mom, your mother getting dressed and going off to the pub where she would pick up people, and it was like the before and after, your mom making herself look so pretty and attractive, and the kind of, and then this horror that would follow. And I was very curious to understand how this making yourself up as a woman, how that felt and how that contributed to this feeling of this kind of crashing.
I mean, I was very conscious of constructing myself every day, of waking up almost completely naked and bare, and nobody really. I felt like there was nothing at the center of me. I felt completely empty, and I felt every day that I had to physically build this person out of makeup and powder and hairspray and weave and not ridiculous, but very quite elaborate outfits. I had a very distinct style, which the hair was part of, the way I dressed was part of it, my tattoos I think were part of it, and I was constructing, I think, quite a twisted version of femininity, because I did have this template with my mum, and she was born in 1960 and lived in a small village for most of her life, and her version of femininity was quite traditional, was often, I felt, to appeal to men. Wasn't really about herself, her own comfort, how she felt. It was very much about being sexually attractive to men, and I think I saw that as something that I both wanted but rejected at the same time, because it was kind of the version of womanhood and femininity that I knew. But I saw it, I think I write in the book about the house being sticky with sex and lust, and something about it repelled me as well. But when I became a woman, I found it something I both embraced but also wanted to distort in some way. So I think part of the thing with my tattoos was kind of a defense almost, and I don't think tattoos are ugly, but putting a bit of ugliness on my skin, because I knew certain men didn't like tattoos, certain men thought tattoos weren't feminine, and I was kind of playing with and almost trying to chip away at and potentially destroy what femininity was and how I embraced that. And part of that, everything was very extreme. So the tattoos were very big and very dark, and the hair was, I see pictures now, and it was, completely vertical, massive. Massive. I don't know what people thought when I walked into rooms, but it wasn't enough. It was still, I wanted to be bigger and higher and straighter, and my shoes got more extreme. Everything was very extreme, and it was almost kind of a exaggerated version of femininity. And what I ended up doing was, I terrified most straight men who saw me in bars, because I'd often be doing karaoke at 3 a.m. with the world's biggest fake beehive, completely kind of drunk, and I must have looked quite terrifying. But I think part of me wanted them not to be attracted to me, wanted them not to find me physically attractive, because I think part of me still feared it, but part of me also wanted to pull apart that traditional notion of femininity that I'd been raised with.
I have to say, Terri, you reminded me in those descriptions, because I thought, just as a writer, it was what you did, but in the metaphor of yourself, in sort of developing this very visceral memoir, which makes you feel it, you made me think of Elizabeth I, because she created as well this kind of spectacle, truly like a spectacle of these clothes, and it was like an armor, like a woman's armor in a sense, and this kind of size you made yourself compared to that little girl who was so defenseless. It was like your armor. I'm sure any of the women listening will recognize something in this idea that you wake up every day and put on your face, you put on your war paint, you put on something that will protect you when you go into a very predatory world. But in that piece, also what struck me so much, and maybe you want to just kind of reach that child and the person you are now, is how unbelievably lonely you were. loneliness of living in New York, which I can remember. I remember when I first got there, when I lived there, I once didn't speak to anybody for 5 days. And then when I did talk to someone, my voice was like over Thanksgiving weekend, and I didn't understand Americans and what they did, but it was, the interactions are so complex. And then how you kind of numbed that. And maybe I was thinking we could go onto your second reading, because it really is you trying to find a way to feel and not feel.
Yeah.
The drinking and the.
And you just obviously mentioned, Thanksgiving weekend. This was set over July 4th weekend. And it's so funny when you say that. I remember a guy in the bodega, going into the bodega to buy cigarettes, and the man touched my hand and he gave me the money back. Yeah. And I realized I hadn't been touched by another person in weeks, and I had such a physical reaction to being touched. So I remember that really vividly. July 2013. It's the holiday weekend, a long weekend with 2 whole days off work. I'm relieved, giddy, and I meet a friend in Julius, the oldest operating gay bar in New York. The drinks, cocktails, vodka, whiskey, wine slide down smoothly. I feed a line of dollar notes into the jukebox, selecting songs by Amy Winehouse, the Supremes and the Shangri-Las, before resting my body against the brightly lit box, which hums from the vibrations of the heartache, loss, and pain in their voices. I twirl the bottle of Vicodin that's been rolling around the bottom of my handbag between my fingers. The white pills bounce, ricochet off their orange plastic home like a pinball machine. A fellow editor at work has gifted me with the full bottle, telling me they made her vomit were too strong. Not me. I have a strong constitution. The first time I swallow one, the stress, worry, and thrum of anxiety dissolves and drips out of me. Happy isn't the word. It's woefully inadequate to describe the state of perfect bliss I descend into, sinking lower and lower into the floor. It is walking on clouds with hands floating wide. It's singing from an open window as the wind flows through. It's a heart-shuddering, soul-heightening joy that I can never truly describe. A room of wool and twine in which I sit, knowing that I can do anything, everything, all of it, whatever I want. No one can stop me ever. Now I know what real, true happiness feels like. I have to ration it. I can't truly begin to cope with what will happen when this happiness is taken from me. This night, however, I know I'm owed it. As the record ends, loads and spins underneath my hip, I swallow 2 tablets, then reach in my bag for a final one, just to be sure, tossing it into the back of my mouth where it hits my throat, stuttering on the way down. I follow it with 2 Xanax, then almost immediately, nothing. The next day I wake up. I can barely open my eyes and keep them open when I do. I'm lying across the bed in yesterday's dress, ankle socks, shoes, beehive askew, hair grips lodged in the skin in my back, bag still over my shoulder. When I do manage to fully open my eyes, I can barely see out of them. I fumble and find my phone. It's 1:30 p.m. My screen is filled with missed calls. I'm meant to be going to Coney Island with a group of women I know. I text one, tell her I overslept. I had a big night. She says they're worried about me, about what I was doing, about what I might have done. I want to cancel, but I can't. The shame on top of whatever else I'm feeling would just be too much. We arranged to meet. We're going to get the train together. I haul my body off the quilt, my stomach already up in my mouth. I throw up once, twice. There's no food in my mouth because there'd been none in my stomach. I can't remember when I last ate. The vomit tastes of whiskey, ginger, lime, wine, beer, and acid. I get in the shower, counting the new small black bruises on me. My thigh, my arm, the bump on my head. I get out of the shower and vomit once more. I put on a new dress, new ankle socks, and my brogues. Comb my matted hair, back comb again. Spray, pat, spray, tease, smooth. I vomit again, harder, longer. Blood hitting, splattering the bowl. I make it to the subway station and onto the train. As it rocks and rolls towards Coney Island, I clutch my stomach. which is cramping and whirling under my fingers, under my skin. My mouth waters, squirts, hitting both sides of my throat after being expelled from the glands. Sweat creates a trim the length of my hairline. At each and every stop, I consider getting off, running through the doors, convinced I'm about to vomit violently, terrified I'm about to faint. A little girl and her dad sit directly opposite me. Her pigtails are pulled tight on each side, her face taut. They both stare at me. Her hand finds his nervously. She's captivated and horrified by my face, and I can't stop picturing hers in my head as I place my hands over my eyes, and all I can see is black throbbing around her, framed by fireworks. Somehow I managed to hold it inside until Coney Island, where I pushed my way out of the train into the nearest trash can, which is already on this boiling hot day, brimming over with discarded hot dogs, burgers, ice creams, sodas, ketchup-smeared fries. With a primal urge that overtakes me, I grab each side of the can, which is open like a flower reaching for the sun. Food squeezes between my palms and the metal as I grab for my life, my head rearing back just once, snapping my body in half as it flips forward, and I vomit loudly. As I buck and spew, there's cheering and applause, heckling from the other subway passengers. When my mouth is empty and my body still, I straighten my back, wipe my face with the back of my hand, spit and spew, running between my fingers and down the outside of my hands, collecting at the wrists. Eat something, I'm told by my kind of friends who have looked on in horror. I queue for a hot dog and a beer by the beach. The line is 30-something people deep. They're in shorts and vests, hugging, laughing and shrieking. I cower in their shadows, sweat running into my hair, down the centre of my back, down both legs into the heels of my shoes. The blue horizon in front of me waves and wobbles. My head swims, my body rocks. The beer, the hot dog have barely passed through my mouth and down my throat before they bounce back up on a fierce wave that has me running, retching to the most private spot I can find, the other side of a concrete wall. I splatter a new pile of bread rolls, sausage, and yellow liquid as neatly as possible onto the ground. It's enough for us all. I say I must leave, I must go home. I get another subway back, take a handful of blue sleeping pills and sleep until Sunday night. And just like that, 2 days and almost 3 nights have been lost. When I wake again, turn on my phone, I see pictures of everyone celebrating the holidays on rooftops, on beaches, cocktails and sparklers in hand, while I lie unconscious alone, they're living lives of joy, of love, a life I say that I don't want.
A miracle you're alive, Terri, and testimony to your fortitude. It's very moving and brave of you to read. And as you were reading and as I read that piece, this desire you had to obliterate yourself, or the need, not desire, I think it was a compulsion to obliterate yourself. And I was wondering how, because it's linked very much, you describe a scene early on when you drink for the first time, where you get a sip of a very strong beer, I think, which your mother gives you. And I was wondering if you could just map a little bit how you actually wrote that, what it felt like to do the actual writing, to return in that kind of visceral way, and then the sort of anesthetizing that you were doing.
Well, it's funny because I know how this sounds, but it's the only way I can think to describe it. I felt like I was talking to that girl that I used to be and who all these things happened to. And I'd pushed her into a corner and ignored her and told her she didn't exist and tried to kind of escape from her for such a long time. And part of the process of writing the book was having a conversation with that girl again and listening to her. So a lot of things I'd repressed very deliberately. I'd never allowed myself to think about. And part of the challenge of writing was that I didn't want there to be anything I left out for vanity reasons. Anybody who's read the book knows that, I don't always seem graceful or great or kind or a good person, but I kind of pledged to be unflinching in including everything, all of the truth. And so revisiting that and trying to trace back where this addictive personality came from, where could I find the line of that first buzz? Where was the first time? And that day that my mum gave me a can of beer for the first time was just like any other day. But this significant thing had happened, and I remembered how it made me feel. And when I was a little girl, I didn't have the language for that, but now I did. And it was about remembering as much as possible, as truthfully as possible. And memory is fallible, and memory is only yours and your perception, but trying to access those feelings, those memories. And to do that, I spent a lot of time alone. I didn't show anybody my writing. It was an entirely an experience between me and the page. And it was very intense, and it was very private. And it was something I had to do entirely alone and kind of in isolation, really, to be able to reach back into those experiences and those memories. And then once I'd kind of located that one, you can trace it. You start to revisit things that you didn't think were significant at the time, or you'd kind of pushed into the back of your memory. And then you start to see the kind of, you just see the path, and it starts to become much clearer once you start to dig out. And it's an excavation, really. I see it as an excavation of memory and experience.
Did absolutely brilliantly and sort of effortlessly. And one of the things I kept thinking of when I was reading you, and I felt so much for that little girl self, that little girl. And in some ways, it seems to me like by bearing witness to her, so yes, memory is infallible, but there's something very courageous and very valuable, I think, in standing alongside that child that you were, who is also many other children. Tragically, I mean, that sort of pattern of neglect and various things. And you made me think of like a war correspondent. You went back into that war zone in a way, that kind of Somme of your childhood, and bore witness to her and saw her. And when as I was reading, it was as if the person writing, the grown woman writing, was like remothering that child, who's this child that we see. And it seemed to me somehow you were returning their shameful gaze. It was like you were returning it.
Yeah, well, I mean, I wanted to reclaim her because I felt very strongly if I could reclaim her, I could reclaim myself. And then, because there's a chapter in the book where I talk about a fantasy of revenge I have about one of the men. And I loved that. I have to just tell you, I absolutely loved it.
And
that was a chapter I wasn't particularly nervous about anything, but I knew that was it's a difficult chapter because I write in great detail about the graphic violence that I would in my fantasy enact on this man. And it was very important for me because that aspect of female rage, which nobody really talks about, which is we talk a lot about how we turn that anger on ourselves, how we internalize it, how we are the source of that. But actually, for me, the turning point came when I shifted that and turned it on them. And then you do have this rage that you don't really know what to do with. And I had a great deal of fantasy about that. And people asked me, oh, would you ever really have done it? And I was like, well, no, but that wasn't the point. It was about actually, for the first time, directing the responsibility and the rage and the objectification in exactly the right area. And that was the important thing. But I think I felt like I'd abandoned that girl and left her and run away from her. And actually, if you could trace back all of my issues and a lot of the stuff that led to, my substance abuse issues and my self-harm and suicidal ideation, and there's mental illness in there, but there's also the act of constantly trying to escape yourself and distance yourself, and what becomes apparent and what became apparent to me is I had to find the only way to become or even attempt to become whole was to go back and get her and say, she is me and I am her, and that act of disconnection isn't going to work, and actually isn't the answer. The answer is to, as you say, reclaim her, protect her. I couldn't protect her at the time, but there's a sense of weirdly being able to protect her now by reclaiming her and by telling that story. And that for me was the way of being able to not turn the hate in on myself, which is where a lot of the harm and the self-hatred came from, and feeling like a whole person, or as close to a whole person as any of us can ever feel.
I thought you talked a lot about shame and the shame as a parent in so many scenes of the book, even if you don't name it that. I think even that vomiting that you described, being not able to metabolize, I suppose, what had happened to you, to be able to take it in. And shame is such a, I don't know, the way you describe it is as though there's something wrong with you, there's something in your body that you need to get out, and what you track, I think, with such, right up until this sort of almost obliteration of yourself, is how you performed or were injected with the shame of a mother who failed to protect you, a young mother. I mean, I think you do a valiant job in making us see your mother with all her challenges and difficulties and shortcomings and various things. But it's as if you're playing out the shame of these utterly shameless adults who felt no shame about looking after you. And I was wondering how you processed that and how you thought about presenting, which is such a common thing amongst women. We feel it, and we're made to feel it so frequently.
Yeah, well, I think especially if you've been abused in any way as a young girl, I think part and parcel of that is often shame, and taking in that shame and accepting it, because all the language around it, the way that the secrecy is cultivated at the time, from something like that to the way it's rarely spoken about afterwards, it's always cloaked in shame. I feel that specifically with childhood sexual abuse. I think there's a completely different kind of shame with that. And, you know, I didn't speak about it for years because I thought it was incredibly shameful. And as much as I knew intellectually that it wasn't my fault, also I felt that it must have been. I write in the book about it happening with two of my mother's partners. Therefore, what was I putting out into the world? And it was really important for me to write honestly about that. And I didn't want anyone to think that's what I genuinely thought, but I think it was really important to be honest about what you feel as somebody who's been through that, and how you take that shame in, and how you basically accept it on behalf of everybody else in the situation. And that's part of actually coming out of it, I think, is relinquishing that shame. And part of writing the book was that, part of being able to put it down on paper, and for people to know that about me, for people to know that had happened to me, that was a hugely important thing. And people talk a lot about, you know, the importance of honesty and speaking about these experiences, and it can sound glib and it can sound cliche, but it's absolutely true, because I think the power of language and the power of us sharing stories and experiences is that you take the power out of it. The toxic power that exists in silence is huge, and is hugely harmful. So I grappled with how I wrote about shame, because I didn't want to feed into those existing narratives, but I also wanted to be really honest about how you feel as a young girl who that's happened to, and the way society makes you feel about where the blame lies and where the shame lies, and kind of how you can move on from feeling like that.
The first time you wrote it, could you believe yourself what had happened to you? Because I had this feeling in the writing, it was like there was somewhere the writer, you, and the reader, me, was saying, this is absolutely true, but could you actually believe it?
Well, there's something about making it real by putting it into words, and it had existed in my head for so long, and obviously, you know, other people knew it happened, and I knew it was a thing that had happened, but because I'd spent so long attempting to forget it, attempting to completely put it behind me, that actually accepting it and then writing about it, I mean, even just putting it into words, I used to do a thing where I didn't tell close friends, I didn't tell many people, I was very ashamed still. And it would be a thing when if I got really drunk and I met, you know, one of those nights where you get drunk and you meet somebody and you think, oh my God, they're amazing, we're going to be best friends forever. And you overshare about something in your life. Like there was a handful of times when I would just tell a stranger who I didn't know this incredibly private thing about me. And I was constantly kind of testing the water about articulating it. And when it came to the book, I wanted to do it in a controlled and deliberate way, because, you know, waking up the morning after a bender, feeling, oh my God, I've just told somebody I don't know about this deep, dark, awful thing, that just compounds the shame and the embarrassment. But actually writing the book was a way of taking control and making it true, because instead of pretending like it hadn't happened and that everything was fine, I wanted to put it out into the world that this did happen and it's not fine, and actually everything isn't magically okay, and be quite brutally honest about the realities of that. But the first step on any of it is actually writing it down, bearing witness, as I think you put it earlier, bearing witness, it being a testament to what has happened, and accepting that that is the truth and that is your experience, and that is something that will be with you for the rest of your life, but doesn't have to define you.
There's something about your memoir in which you are, if we can do a bit of the Greeks, seeing as you've had Elizabeth I, we might as well have Persephone and her mother Demeter, because a girl like you, I kept on thinking you were not mothered and protected and shaped or held by your mother's gaze or her heart or whatever. So you go down into this abyss like Persephone does, goes right down to Hades, into the sort of valley of zone of death. And I think that I'm going to ask you to do your third reading now, which is about this suicidal ideation and various things. But what's so interesting and made me think of what you were talking about in the writing is that the reader knows you're accompanying by yourself. You've been through this and shaped it into language. And I think you articulate so well how many of us feel what we come up with. So this is the bit for those of you who have tender feelings about, about Terri's own kind of self-rescue in a way, I think it is.
Okay. Karaoke was a doomed saviour, but one I sought out because my condition was worst in the evenings. As the sun set, hope swirled away to be replaced by deep cellular fear, my entire body erecting and alert. Growing in dark corners like the night blooming cirrus, waiting for the moon to peel open her petals and welcome life in. But I'm not welcoming life in, I'm welcoming the absence of it. I know every night I lie spread wide, everything is at stake again. Will I make it to the other side, to the rising of the light again? Will I be happy that I have? Trying to place my arms, even my hands around the fear is not just difficult, it's impossible. It's a totality I can't comprehend, but I can see and identify and speak to shapes, fragments of the fear. The fear is this, that I'll never live happily and quietly, only violently and in pain. The fear is this, that I'll never love truly, never be loved truly. The fear is this, that I'll never be stitched together, my secrets, my indignities, my humiliations, my violations, my shame will flap noisily against the loose bones that rub my skin red, rub my skin raw. The fear is this, that the fog will snake and choke, trapping my breath, that I won't wake, won't stand and put my left foot upon the floor, that the moment will have swallowed me whole, swallowed me alive. The fear is this, that the fog won't snake and choke, but choose to let me breathe, that I'll wake, that I'll stand and put my left foot upon the floor, that the moment will pass, as it always does, before blooming in my belly, curdling as it swells. Every morning sees the beginnings of hope, the promise of growth, and then every night it turns inwards and withers all over again. Once the taste of death has been under your tongue, lodged along the edges of your gums, it never leaves your mouth, ever. It's not always the first thing you smack your lips at when you wake up, or the last thing you savour before your senses shut down for the night. But you can hack and rinse and spit as much as you like. It always remains, and it takes little to bring the taste vividly into the present. The sight of the sea through a window, the sound of waves crashing against rocks, a butter knife glinting in the sunlight that hits the cutlery drawer as you open it. I sleep very little, just lie unconscious for a few hours, so spend hours in the dawn light imagining the various ways, the minute intricacies of the methods on offer. The fantasies set my pulse racing. I stick a pair of scissors in my neck, mouth pulled tight, silently screaming at the cracks in the ceiling. With all my strength, I pulled the blade down, across and around my throat in a circular motion as the blood shoots out and the fatty skin swells and contracts. I feel the thick rope between my fingers, see my body standing on the bed to loop the rope around the light fitting, feeling the rub against my neck as I place my head within its jaws. I taste the pills as they speed over my tongue into the back of my throat, falling down into my belly. I stand on top of the cliff, wind whipping my hair, and close my eyes as I jump, first my right leg and then the left, trailing a little behind. They flail and whirl as I fall fast, my body breaking into pieces as it hits the concrete water. I steal a red pickup truck, leap a pipe from the exhaust, wind the windows up tight, turn on the radio and sit and wait, breathing in the end. I read about a young woman who threw herself off the George Washington Bridge, leaving her Xanax and her handbag behind. I follow in her path, step into the footprint she left behind her retreating frame, across the brow of the bridge to the spot that she'd chosen to jump to her death. It becomes an obsession that coils around the insides of my mind, tainting everything it touches until my brain is flooded by thoughts of suicide. There is no room for any other thoughts or any other dreams. I found a website that lists all methods of suicide, rating them for pain and statistical likelihood of success. I rank my preferred methods, praying for the intersection of little pain and high chances of success. It tells me that for each one successful suicide attempt, there are 33 unsuccessful ones. It assures me that for anyone committed to killing themselves, achieving the goal can be straightforward if a reliable method is chosen. This makes me feel comforted. It makes me feel rational. I'm applying logic to my decision. There is, as it turns out, no painless way to die. I measure the presumed physical pain against the mental pain I am currently collapsing inwards under. If the latter is unbearable, would the former be bearable because it would mean the end of what I couldn't take? And how much does it hurt? How much pain is there in a bullet speeding into your brain or your heart? What do you know, feel before you know and feel nothing? If hanging doesn't break your neck and you die by suffocation, how much pain is there? And for how long? I've written 5, maybe 6 suicide notes in my life. It strikes me as something you should probably remember. The specific number of times you've put your final message to the world on paper, in ink, in pencil, in last resort lipstick, the precise set of circumstances around each one, to give it the gravity, the weight it's supposed to hold, if nothing else. The smooth barrel of the pen between my second and third finger, the faint blue lines marking out the path my words are to travel, the bone in my right wrist scuffing the paper as they creep across in single file. But that's not how it works. It snatches, shapes, sounds, fragments, shadows, small, sharp stories of despair. And at the very middle of it, me, 5 or 6 notes saying, I'm sorry, I can't, I won't. And now that I think on it, it may well even be 7. Not that it matters, especially even if it should. The time I will come closest to succeeding and dying, I won't actually write a note at all. Not a word. not a second in which I pause with a pen or scarlet lipstick tube ready to load and fire. For there will be no thought at all, only doing, doing, doing until it's done. Well, almost done, almost.
You are a warrior, Terri, to do that battle. I think you, and I read that, but I thought you get so evocatively the size of this monster. I mean, I've had thoughts like this myself at various times in my life, and the sort of, you evoke so much how it takes over every single inch of this thing that steals everything from you, your work, your enjoyment of life. It's like this greedy, thieving ogre. And I think perhaps what we can, I mean, I suppose the testimony to your kind of going through and kind of rescuing yourself is this wonderful book and wonderful you sitting there talking to me. I was wondering if you could just tell us a little bit how you get from that absolute nadir, that desperate looking for a place where you will not suffer, out of that murderous gaze of people who didn't care to keep you alive, how you have turned this around, because it's such hard work.
And it's a long process. So after I overdosed and was sectioned in New York, I stayed in New York for another year or so after that, and I realized that the city and it was a very toxic combination, that all of the vulnerabilities and insecurities and things that I struggled with were really exacerbated in New York, like loneliness, the intensity of the city. And I knew that I had to move home. And when I moved home, I wasn't fixed by any stretch of the imagination, but I knew that if I moved home, I was choosing myself, and I was choosing to save myself, just for want of a better phrase, but that was the only way I saw it, that I could only save myself by moving home. And I moved home, and I just craved some kind of stability. And I used to hunt out joy. It was always about joy and happiness. When will I be happy? When will I be joyful? And actually, it's just the radical act is not wanting to die. The radical act is waking up every day and being glad to be alive and looking forward to the day. Something so prosaic and mundane, that's radical to me. And I don't think constant happiness and constant joy is attainable or sustainable. And I think it will always be hard work for me. I have mental illness. I've obviously got trauma from what happened when I was a girl. And I think it's always going to be work, but I'm now prepared to do that work because it's worth it to be alive. And for many years, you know, the reason I wanted to write about suicide and suicidal ideation so honestly is because I think people think of suicide as this fleeting act of madness that kind of disappears. As long as you can get through that moment, then it isn't there in the morning. Suicidal ideation means it's there 24 hours a day, every waking and sleeping moment. And that can feel impossible to live with. And that's the thing. And that's the thing I really struggled with. And what I wanted to get to is a place where I wanted to live more than I didn't want to live. And that was what I saw as success. And that's what I worked towards. And you know, now I absolutely want to live. And I never thought, there was a long time when I never thought I would be able to say that as a statement and mean it. And I do. And that's, and I know I keep calling it radical, but that for me is a radical change.
Well, I think it is radical. And what's very apparent as well is your courage in the writing, but your courage at the time. And when you wrote, when I was reading the bit about thinking about suicide, looking for, you know, thinking it through, it made me think that it reminded me of your descriptions of yourself as a little girl who kept her head down, who got out of the way, who was very canny somehow and courageous and kind of navigating this. And I had this strong feeling that she was there in this adult self. You know, you've talked a lot about how you abandoned your child self, but there was something in that little survivor that you described so well, who returned to you in this and gave you a courage and says, just duck, just because of course all the Googling stops you from doing anything. The writing of the notes distracts you. And I really had this feeling that you kind of, she came and she helped you back there. And yeah, I think that, I don't know, I just felt the way that you'd written was such a kind of, yeah, it was really like a warrior. You went in there and fought. And we did have planned to do a final reading, but I see we're right at the end of our time. So I was just wondering quickly, you returned home. It's obviously the sense of like back to London, back to England, where people who loved you, so that idea of love was coming through. What were the things that sort of helped you along, you know, kind of like that you could draw on to get you through?
It was definitely family. I became very close to my brother and my sister, and they were hugely important. That sense of having a family, knowing that I was loved, having people that I loved in return, that foundation was really important. And then there was a lot of stuff around my own behaviour, around drinking, around prescription pills. I just had to change a lot of my own everyday behaviour. And I think I will be on probably some form of medication for most of my life, probably in and out of therapy. I think it's a constant piece of work that you have to do. I think the conceit, and I think it's something that is problematic these days, the conceit that you'll get over it at some point and you'll fix it at some point and there'll be a magic solution, and it isn't. It's learning to live with it and then continuing to live with it. And that for me, that shift in mindset of not wanting to get over it, not expecting to get over it, and therefore feeling a failure because I wasn't replacing that with an acceptance, was really important to me. And then it was just, as I say, want that basic thing of feeling like I had a life that was worth living for. That was the big shift for me.
Well, I'm so happy you did, because your book is fabulous. So this is right at the end. I could go on talking to you for ages and we didn't get round to questions. But the writing and the creativity, writing is really funny in places. And, you know, the sort of your creative, generative, generous self kind of seems to flower and blossom. So I hope we meet again. And
so do I.
In real life. And thank you for writing this.
Thank you.
And
thank you so much.
Goodbye to all our friendly people out there in the participants.
Yes, thank you if you came along, and thank you, Margie, that was brilliant.
Good, so nice it was lovely to talk to you. Thank you, Carolyn.
Thank you, that was immense. That was so powerful. So thank you both to our audiences here and on YouTube who you're watching just now, but thank you to you both for that powerful conversation. It was really brilliant. So thanks.
Thanks for having us.
Have a good night. Bye.
Bye.